We are anxiously awaiting for news of a resumption of the rollout of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine program. We're eager for preparations for phase 2 of our vaccine rollout to get underway on May the 17th. While our rollout has, of course, been hampered by challenges and delays internally, the truth is vaccine nationalism is real, and the developing world is at the back of the queue, despite efforts by COVAX, as one example, to assist poorer nations. Trade and Industry Minister Patel has written an opinion piece for the Daily Maverick about this, and he joins me now. Minister, thank you so much for your time. You've written that we need a new deal. What would be in that new deal that's different?
Well, thank you, and good evening, Sally. We face an unprecedented health and economic crisis, and access to vaccines is essential for us to address that crisis. So in a meeting of the World Trade Organization, we put forward the idea of a COVID package or a new deal with 5 elements that can address this. The first is we need to dramatically scale up production of vaccines in partnership with companies, covering things like investment, funding, know-how, and so on. But we also need, and this is the second element, a time-bound and targeted waiver of certain intellectual property arrangements and agreements globally. We need a set of protocols covering transparency of contracts and prices, and a commitment to avoid resort to vaccine nationalism. And finally, we've got to look at the institutional machinery in future to address pandemics of this nature. And where all of this comes from, Sally, is that currently about 80% of vaccines have been administered in just 10 countries. So there's a very, very significant shortage. And we need to do things unusual to be able to roll out a scaled-up production of vaccines so that more people can have access to it, lives can be saved, and we can do so before we have significant further loss of life. So that, in essence, is what the New Deal is. It's about production, it's about a waiver, it's about getting an agreement globally on these matters with pharmaceutical companies.
And there does seem to be growing support. I mean, this is the thing. I'm wondering where the problem might be in trying to achieve what you're talking about, because 58 WTO members, you write, have co-sponsored this waiver proposal, which is point 2 of your plan. Another 60 have indicated their support. We are seeing also individual nations, trading blocs coming out and saying we need to do this. Talk to us about this waiver proposal, what exactly it means. So most countries across the world, Sally, are covered by a global agreement in the World Trade Organization that regulates intellectual property and some areas of copyright, of course. And it's called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, in short, TRIPS. Now, the TRIPS agreement requires that countries may not use something that is patented without the authority or the permission of the owner of the property. However, the agreement itself recognizes that there are unusual times when countries may need to do what is called compulsory licensing, or even when those terms themselves may be waived. And in this pandemic, vaccines as well as diagnostic kits and ventilators and other essential provisions are covered by TRIPS. So a firm in, say, South Africa or India or Brazil may not utilize that intellectual knowledge without the agreement of a patent holder. What the waiver would do, for a limited time, it would exempt certain kinds of products from the TRIPS agreement and enable countries and firms to produce those on scale. That's the heart of the proposal. All right. And I want to also speak to you about the third point you raise around transparency of contracts. Our own health minister, and obviously I want to bring this home to us a little bit more as well. He has spoken about how difficult those contracts are. We also know that there are liability clauses where the country that buys the vaccine has to set up its own fund should there be any legal action or any ramifications or damage from those vaccines. At the moment, it doesn't seem like those contracts are transparent at all, and it seems they are very tough negotiations. Would you agree? I would indeed agree. In fact, my colleague, Minister Zweli Mkhize, told Parliament that in one instance, one of the big pharma players had proposed that they must have the right to attach the assets of countries in the event that there are claims against them by people who have used the vaccine. Now, I mean, that's just one example. Many countries have given us instances of this disparity in bargaining power between an individual company and someone who has a scarce good. And so we've got to deal with this thing with the requisite degree of authority. In October last year, India and South Africa tabled this TRIPS proposal, and at the time, there were 1 million people who had died as a result of COVID. Today, more than 3 million have died. And so there's an urgency, a need for the world to act in unison. And so we're talking to neighboring countries, we're talking to developed countries, trying to build a new international consensus that we can, in fact, use every available means to try to stem this pandemic and provide essential medication. South Africa has been this year before, if you recall, many, many years ago, when HIV medication was beyond the capacity of many people who were ill. And we had to similarly run a global campaign and put pressure on many players until eventually some agreement was reached that allowed us to roll out the world's biggest HIV program, as it were, at the time. Now we need to do something on an even bigger scale because this virus, COVID-19, affects all parts of the world.
Minister, who's got to blink first? Is it, and obviously there has to be a balance. I don't think anyone is suggesting that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't recoup the billions they've put into research for these vaccines. We have seen a lot of sharing of information around how to work these vaccines. But who has to blink first? I mean, is it that the pharmaceutical companies have to give a little? Is it the nations that haven't bought in to some of these suggestions to make sure it's fair and equitable? What is the next move? Who needs to make it?
I think we need progress on two fronts. The one is we are in negotiation at the moment in the World Trade Organization, and in fact the TRIPS Council had a meeting today, and over the next few months we hope we can, as soon as possible, get an agreement. We need to have the overwhelming majority of WTO members agreeing to this, and then we need to try to appeal to the last remaining few to also join that consensus. There will then be a meeting of trade ministers in Geneva where a formal agreement could then be confirmed. At the same time, we're talking to pharmaceutical companies as individual countries, but the new head of the World Trade Organization is also reaching out to the pharmaceutical companies and engaging them to say, can't we find a solution that will save lives? So it's on both fronts at the level of countries in the World Trade Organization who set up the global rules, as well as pharmaceutical companies who, of course, administer and have legal ownership of the patents. And I want to finally perhaps make this point, that it's not just the research of the pharmaceutical companies. There's also been enormous sums of money that's been put in by governments across the world in backing, supporting, and subsidizing the research and development that goes into the development of these vaccines.
Minister, I know that it is the Health Minister who's going to tell us when our vaccine program is going to restart. Can you give us a hint as to how long we're still going to have to wait?
Our Health Minister is a very effective communicator, and I know he will do a great job in putting that to the South African public. Of course, when he speaks, he wants to know that he's tied up every little bit, and that it's not just the access to the vaccines, but the logistics systems, getting those vaccines, keeping them in cold storage, having all the places where the vaccines would be administered. He would want to announce all of that, and I'm sure he'll do a great job.
Okay, so I didn't think you'd give me an answer, but I had to try. Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion indeed. Trade and Industry Minister Ibrahim Patel.